Good morning, how are you? Oh my god, it's so good to see you again. I literally was just thinking about you. Today we're going to be talking about the afterlife in ancient Egypt and specifically ancient Egyptian religion and stuff. Why? Because I want to stop asking questions. If you're interested in archaeology and ancient history, then I probably have lots of videos that would pertain to your interests. But today we're going to be talking about the afterlife in ancient Egyptian society because it's really interesting and cool. Bitch, okay? One of the cornerstones of society in ancient Egypt was the belief in the afterlife. We know this because of how much it appears in the archaeological record and how much we can see about afterlife rituals. So to fully comprehend the beliefs of the afterlife in ancient Egypt, I think it's important to kind of outline Egyptian religion and what the religious beliefs were. So ancient Egyptian religion was similar to a lot of other polytheistic ancient religions like ancient Greece, ancient Mesopotamian, even ancient Roman. So they would worship multiple gods, and all of these gods would have intricate relationships between themselves, and they would also be representative of natural phenomena. It was impossible to live in this society without the underpinnings of religion. Religion was the basis for which you lived. There was no sort of atheism or agnosticism back in ancient Egypt. The ultimate goal of this religion was to define the connection between the mortal world and the divine world, so the world of humans and the world of gods. And the divine world was represented in terms of mortal phenomena such as childbirth, air, the ocean, the sun. All of these things were deified. So all of these natural phenomena were thought to be representative of gods who were the divine, and that was their impact on the mortal world. Formal religious practice centered on pharaohs who were believed to possess divine powers by virtue of their position. It was universally believed that the pharaoh was the embodiment of the god Horus and had been appointed by the divine to act as a bridge between divinity and mortality. What I find really interesting is that due to the divine nature of the pharaohs, they sometimes had a say in how and in which deities were worshipped. By this I mean that at various times certain deities became preeminent over others, and this was dependent on which pharaoh, whichever they were like, you know, with a god, and so they just made them the preeminent god. For example, under the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the god Aten replaced the traditional pantheon. So you had this god Aten who was being worshipped to the detriment of the worship of the other gods in the pantheon and in this polytheistic religion. It's important to note that this is not monotheism. Aten was not the only god. The other gods still had some influence and they still had their divine qualities, but it is an example of how impactful the pharaoh is over the world of the divine, because all of a sudden Aten was being praised and almost like revered as this one god above all the others, essentially. Akhenaten represented himself as the son of Aten himself, so as the son of a god. Egyptian deities had complex interrelationships which are reflected in the natural forces that they represented. To make sense of these relationships, the Egyptians would often group certain gods together and you would worship them as a unit. A group with immense wide-ranging importance was the Ennead, 9 gods combined into one theological system. The Ennead, this group of gods came together to tell the story of creation and the myth of creation in Egyptian religion. And every religion needs a creation myth. We got Adam and Eve, we've got Prometheus, we've got all that shit. Okay, so essentially what went down, according to ancient Egyptian religion, I was not there, but I assume that this is true. The earth was just these primordial waters, and then from these primordial waters, a mound grew. And atop it sat the self-actualizing god Atum, which essentially means that he created himself. And then this is our first contradiction, because he either spat or masturbated. Either way, he produced an air. Choose your own adventure. From this, he produced air, which is like literal air, which was personified as Shu, and moisture, personified as Tefnut. Then these siblings, and they produced Geb, which is the earth, and Nut, which is the night sky. And then from this beautiful pairing of Geb and Nut, we get 4 children: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. And they became respective couples in turn. Okay, there's not a lot of variation going on right now. So within ancient Egyptian religion, like with a lot of religions in antiquity, we have a lot of these contradictions kind of come up where these stories can take many forms and they can have multiple different truths which are all correct. There's almost this sort of cognitive dissonance where many iterations of the same story can at once be true. They were just able to hold in their heads that all of these were in some way correct and all of these made sense. Because they were able to hold a lot of truths within themselves about their religion, we often see a lot of contradictions come up when we're trying to tell the story of ancient mythology. So if you notice that any of these stories aren't like the ones you heard of, that's might be why. There's just lots of different versions of mythology that we can pick from, which is pretty cool. Despite the details of Egyptian religion being a little bit contradictory, The main themes of the faith are very, very clear. The main role that the gods played in the universe was to maintain Ma'at, or order, and repel Isfet, the chaos. This thematic is replicated many times throughout Egyptian mythology, and we can see it clearly in the Ennead. So Osiris and Isis, favorite sibling goals, are directly opposing Set and Nephthys. So Osiris and Isis represent fertility and order, and Set and Nephthys represent disorder and chaos. But this is important. It's important to have both so that you can balance out the scales of the cosmos. You can't have one without the other. There is no good or evil. Like, you want to maintain Ma'at and you want to have order, but you also need to balance it with Isfet. Like, that's really interesting if we compare it to kind of modern day religion. Like, if you compare it to Islam or Christianity, where you have these two dichotomous sort of like good and evil. You have heaven and you have hell. Religion in antiquity didn't really have that. You have this chaos and this order, but there is no good or evil. Those specific things come into religion a lot later. Although you do want to repel the chaos, you still need it to balance out the universe. Anyways, little tangent over. So Ma'at was the center of the Egyptian worldview. It was a central guiding principle of what was fair and balanced. And although it was this larger-than-life concept, Ma'at was also anthropomorphized and personified as a woman, often seated with an ostrich feather in her hair. And this feather is quite important in the weighing of the heart ceremony, which you've probably heard about, and I will go into detail. Ma'at's direct opposite is Isfet, disorder, chaos, pain, perversion, decay, and war. And the main role of the pharaoh in all of this was to maintain Ma'at and keep the balance of the cosmos. One way that the king would do this was through conducting a series of foundation rituals at the beginning of temple sites. So in ancient Egyptian belief, all temple construction was symbolically the king's work. It was not actually the king's work. There were hundreds of workers who actually built the temples, but did they get any of the credit? Fuck no, this was before unions existed. And the state dedicated enormous sums to the building of these temples. Each temple was dedicated to a specific god. It would often be like the regional god, like, you know, the god of that specific region. But they were actually not often used for public use, which is how we think of like churches and temples nowadays. Temples were extremely, extremely sacred back in ancient Egypt, so much so that the public wasn't really allowed to use. The performance of temple rituals was an official duty, and if it wasn't done by the king, then it was done by an extremely high-ranking priest. So instead of temples, majority of people would just practice their religion in their private homes. The temple was basically just for the king to suck it. Temples were important in ancient Egyptian afterlife belief because once a pharaoh died, the temple was where you would go to offer them provisions for the afterlife. We're not sure if these temples would have been any different to the ones that were specifically dedicated to deities, but I think our uncertainty about whether or not these temples are any different to the ones that were related to gods kind of reflects the possibility of the Egyptian people maybe having this really close connection, maybe being uncertain themselves of whether their kings were really gods. Now we can talk about the afterlife, and most importantly, you didn't think I was going to leave you high and dry. No, we're talking about the Book of the Dead. Psh. That shit's the coolest thing ever. Are you kidding me? I'm sure you've heard of the Book of the Dead before. If you haven't, you're fucking about to. The afterlife was of undeniable importance to the ancient Egyptians, and we know this because of their funerary texts. They had formulated intricate details of the journey from the mortal world into the afterlife and what happened once you got there. These stories, spells, all that were written in hieroglyphic or hieratic text, and they were written on papyrus scroll. And then they were placed in the coffin or burial chamber of the deceased, and they became what we now call the Book of the Dead. Contrary to its name, there is no one singular Book of the Dead. Like, there isn't just one sort of standardized one. People would often get them commissioned, and they would contain various different mixed matches of spells that that person believed would be most important to them in their afterlife. But the Book of the Dead is not the first example of funerary texts that we see in ancient Egypt. Funerary texts can actually be traced back all the way to the Old Kingdom around 2400 BC in pyramid texts. These were texts that were carved into the walls of pyramids, and they contain multiple spells that were designed to assist the pharaoh in his transition to the afterlife. Important to note that only pharaohs had this, sometimes their wives and the queens, but mostly it was just the kings. Like, no regular person had a pyramid. Well, because no regular person had a pyramid, so no regular person was going to have a pyramid text. So we're only seeing the pharaohs kind of have this rite of passage through the afterlife currently. And what's interesting is that we can see the afterlife being represented as this sort of celestial landscape in these pyramid texts. And I have some excerpts to prove it. So the afterlife was believed to be in the sky at this point, because we see on the pyramid text it writes, "He hath gone up into the sky and hath found Ra, who standeth up when he draweth nigh unto him. And a ramp to the sky is built for him, that he may go up to the sky thereon." So we're seeing that the afterlife takes place in the sky. It's a celestial landscape. This changes by the time we get around to the Book of the Dead, but I'll tell you more about that when we get there. The principal objective of pyramid texts was to enable the transformation of the deceased into an ark. The ark is the Egyptian concept of the soul. Oh baby, this shit, this is so cool. This is the coolest part ever of anything ever. I'm just so excited to talk about it. Okay. The entire soul was called the ark, and the ark was made up of around 8 separate parts. So we have the ket, which is like the physical body. Then you've got the sa, which is the spiritual body. You've got the ren, which is the name or the identity of the person. This is also pretty important. You've got the ba, which is the personality. You've got the ka, which is like the vital essence. I guess it's kind of what we would think of as the soul. Then there's the ib, which is the heart, also very important. There's the shut, or the shadow, which I kind of want to make a whole video about, but it's just the shadow for now. And then there's the sekhet, which is the power. The ark was an amalgamation of all those things. And once a soul had successfully transitioned into the afterlife, all those parts would come together and they would live on in the form of an ark. By the Middle Kingdom, we have a bit of a progression from pyramid texts into another funerary text, which is coffin text. These were written on the inner walls of the coffins of wealthy individuals. Note, I said wealthy individuals. That's right, ladies and gentlemen and others in the crowd. We're not just getting pharaohs have this sort of right to pass into the afterlife anymore. We're seeing it for the rich as well. Only the rich have souls. You heard it here first. So now a lot more people are participating in the afterlife, as opposed to just the king. A brand new afterlife concept also begins to be explored in coffin texts, which is this idea of judgment from the god Osiris. These texts allude to the importance of balance. Coffin texts differ from pyramid texts because they introduce the idea of the afterlife being a subterranean landscape as opposed to a celestial one. So before we saw the afterlife was in the sky, not anymore, bitch. It's under the ground now. The afterlife is labeled as the duat, and it's ruled over by the god Osiris. The duat is absolutely fucking terrifying. It is labeled as threatening, has lots of tricks, and it's basically designed to trap you and kill you. It was meant to challenge you so that if you got through it, you were really worthy of, being alive / dead. So with the help of the spells on the coffin text, you were supposed to be able to traverse the duat a lot more easily and avoid dying a second death, which was a real fear that the ancient Egyptians had. They were like, we die, right? Then we go into the afterlife. And wouldn't it suck if we died again? I don't know why they were so worried about that. Sorry, I'm going on another tangent, but there's no proof that the afterlife exists or any religion is true. Okay, just bear with me, please. I'm right. There's no proof, so why wouldn't you just make one nice? Like, why does it have to be shitty? I guess because it mirrors reality, and reality is very it's not perfect. But if you could make a world after life, why wouldn't you make it good? Why do you have to make it difficult for people? I don't know. Okay, now we're actually talking about the Book of the Dead. So the Book of the Dead is a systematic progression from both pyramid and coffin texts. It developed towards the end of the Second Intermediate Period, so we're thinking like 1700 BC. It's based off of the information from the previous funerary texts. The earliest Book of the Dead that we currently have is that of the Queen Mentuhotep from the 16th dynasty. Her book consists of mostly older spells that we've seen in coffin and pyramid texts and a few new ones. And by the 17th dynasty, we are seeing the Book of the Dead for lots of people, not just pharaohs. And still mainly the elite, but it's a lot more widespread. So it took the form of hieroglyphics written on linen shrouds and wrapped around the dead, although they are occasionally found written on papyrus. The New Kingdom Book of the Dead is when we are introduced to the wonderful spell 125 that you probably all know and love, the weighing of the heart. The spell is first seen during the reign of the absolute bombshell Queen Hatshepsut around 1475 BC. We are currently aware of 192 spells that can be in the Book of the Dead, but no manuscript contains them all. Like I said, people would get these commissioned and they would chock them full of spells that they believed would help them the most in their specific afterlife. These spells were important to the deceased so that they would be able to traverse the duat, but they were also important to the people who were preparing the body of the deceased. So spells related to the preservation of the body may have been recited during the mummification of the the deceased. A very important aspect of which was the heart. In ancient Egypt, the heart was thought of similarly to how we might think of the mind now. We think of the mind as containing our memory and our identity. That's what the heart was in ancient Egypt. It's where intelligence, consciousness, and memory resided. As such, it was very, very important to keep it protected with spells. And also, sometimes people were buried with a jeweled scarab, heart scarab, to replace their physical heart, which was kept inside the body. Very important that your heart was kept inside the body, because you could not go into the afterlife without a heart. If you died and someone took your heart, they were cursing you to eternal doom and your soul would never reach paradise. Because the heart was treated with such care, it makes it obvious, to me at least, that identity was a huge, huge part of the concept of the self and the concept of the afterlife. It's obvious that you needed the memory of your past life to transport yourself into the next one. And we can see this idea kind of come up in spell 25 of the Book of the Dead. Spell 25 made sure that the deceased person would remember their own name. And here we have again that idea that the name is tied to your identity and tied to your memory. The name of the dead person was written many, many times within the Book of the Dead. Sometimes they would even be like more standardized Book of the Deads. They'd be created by a specific manufacturer, and then you could kind of buy one. And then you would write your own, like they would leave a blank space and you just write your name in there, and then that would be your Book of the Dead. So it was kind of like a fill in the blanks Book of the Dead. The book also mentions the importance of maintaining the satisfaction of the ka. If you remember, I said earlier, the ka was like this vital essence, this spirit. And it was important to keep this nourished and satisfied even after death. Spell 105 explains that the ka requires offerings such as food, water, and incense well into the grave. And it was expected that priests or the family of the deceased would continue to offer this sustenance. The spells from the Book of the Dead clearly need a sacred place where one can offer this sustenance and this stuff, and where one can be buried and make their way through the duat and into the afterlife. So we see the construction of sacred tombs for any and all who could afford them. Tombs really varied in size and design throughout ancient Egypt, but their purpose always remained the same: to house the body of the dead and allow the transport of the soul into the underworld. So it was very common for tombs to be built during the lifetime of the person they were dedicated to. So they kind of decide how grand they wanted their tomb to be and how much they wanted to brag about their wealth. And also it took a really long time to build them, so you didn't want to die and then have your body just like rotting for like, I don't know, a year while your tomb was being built. Tombs were generally quite an affluent production, but the goods deposited in them varied drastically depending on how rich you were, how important you were, and how much people would be willing to sacrifice to your death. For example, one of my favorite tombs is tomb KV46 in the Valley of the Kings. But this is one of the richest examples of an Egyptian tomb that we have to date. There's lots of domestic furniture, kind of giving the sense this is supposed to be like a recreation of a house. There's alabaster vases. There are 18 boxes of dried food, which, keep in mind, this would have just been gone under the ground, so people wouldn't have been able to eat. Like, you're spending so much money, effort, and resources on something that's not going to be used. So just imagine how much you must have had to spare this much to the dead. We see a chariot and a large wooden sarcophagi for both the tomb owners. The tomb owners were Yuya and Thuya, a husband and a wife. An immense amount of wealth was expended on this fucking tomb. And we cannot just assume that everyone who died was able to afford something like this. Not everyone could afford so much opulence to the dead. Regardless of the expenditure, all tombs aimed to guide the deceased into the afterlife. And that was something that could be achieved by anyone. If the spells in the Book of the Dead were followed to a T, you were preserved correctly by the people who presumably loved you in life, and you had your spells in the Book of the Dead, you would go to the duat, the underworld. There are many different depictions that we see in ancient Egyptian art of how one arrived there. And these seem to be based kind of on your status. So for example, passages to the duat by boat are strictly restricted to pharaohs. This is assumed to be because the sun god Ra also travels to the underworld via boat, and the pharaoh is the only one of high enough importance and of high enough status to replicate his journey. There is actually archaeological evidence for ancient Egyptian pharaohs accessing the duat through boat. And just get ready for this is insane. An example of this is the Khufu ship, which is a life-sized ship that was built and then ritually sacrificed at Giza along with Pharaoh Khufu, which would allow him to travel to the duat. So they made this entire fucking boat. It did not use it. Just so that Khufu could get to the afterlife in a boat in style. Are you shitting me? They buried a whole fucking boat I'm sorry. If we have a look at the Khufu boat and we have a look at this picture, which is depicting Ra on a boat, bitch, that's the same boat. So we can assume that, this boat was made for Khufu to travel to the afterlife. And also because it was buried in his pyramid. What? A more common vehicle to access the afterlife was the coffin. And this was a little bit more affordable. It could be accessed by most people living in ancient Egypt, which is good. The coffin takes a different path to the underworld though. In opposition to the boat, which is associated with Ra, the coffin is often associated with the goddess of the sky, Nut. But regardless, you get to the duat, okay? And once you're in the duat, the soul of the dead, it was confronted with lots of challenges, lots of tricks to try and get you kind of caught off your guard and make sure your heart was worthy. It was believed that the ancient Egyptians had to pass through gates, all the while battling monsters, which were like a hybrid mix of animals or people with animal heads. And if you passed all of these tests, you were brought before the god Osiris and his council. This is the weighing of the heart, spell 125 in the Book of the Dead. The heart of the deceased was taken out and weighed on a scale against the ostrich feather of Ma'at. I told you that was going to be important. So Ma'at, the order of the cosmos, all things good in the world. Your heart was weighed against essentially the principles of Ma'at, represented by the ostrich feather. Osiris was there, Anubis was there, he was the god of the dead. Thoth was there, he was the scribe, he would kind of record the results and be like, oh shit, you passed, or no, not so good. And then the monster Amit was there, my favorite girl. She had the head of a crocodile, the front legs of a lion, the back legs of a hippopotamus. She's a bit of a badass. In order to succeed in this moment of judgment, your heart would have to be on par with the feather, could not be heavier. You stand in front of Osiris, you have to say a list of things that you did not commit during your life. So you repeat a list of sins that you did not commit. I have not eaten of the fruit of knowledge. I don't know, something like that. Then your heart's weighed. If it fails, then it's devoured by our goddess Amit. Yeah, she eats your heart. Yeah. Your entire essence is gone from the universe forever because you were not worthy. So if you did good on this test, Amit did not devour your heart and execute you from the rest of life. You instead got to live with Osiris in paradise forever. So the afterlife paradise desired by all those in ancient Egypt was called the sekhet aaru, or the field of reeds, which is basically an idolized version of reality. It was like this beautiful, lush, abundant garden with greens and waterfalls, very important when you live in the middle of a desert. It is actually described in one account in the papyrus of Neb Sebi as kind of being divided into islands. Like you have this one kind of main spot and then you have lots of separate islands kind of coming off of it that could only be accessed by boat. And to me, I'm thinking like are there parts of the sekhet aaru that could only be accessed by the pharaoh? Because if we remember, the pharaoh was the only one who could access the duat and the afterlife through a boat. So is this the same for the field of reeds? Could parts of it only be accessed by the pharaoh because he was the only one who had the boat? Maybe. We don't actually know, but I thought that was interesting. Anyway, it's in the sekhet aaru where the soul meets the Ennead and requires aspects of divinity. It's really cool, really fun. It's also possible at this point that the soul is like reunited with its earthly body. And I say this because there is one example on an inscription of the sarcophagus of King Merneptah from the late 13th century BC. This evokes the voice of the goddess Neith, and she says, I unite your limbs, I hold your discharges together, I surround your flesh, I drive away the fluids of your decay, I complete you and form you as Re. That sounds to me like you're kind of getting your body back, but I don't know, maybe not. And thusly, the whole concept of ancient Egyptian religion is achieved. Ma'at has been upheld by this individual and they will live the rest of their afterlife in paradise with Osiris. The whole goal of ancient Egyptian religion and belief in the afterlife was to live your life on earth, maintaining the orders of Ma'at, so that when you died, you would not die a second death and you would instead be transferred into paradise, the sekhet aaru, and live out your eternity with Osiris. It's honestly not that dissimilar to current day religions. I feel like there's this kind of idea of the underworld and paradise. Although we're living some 5,000 years apart, we still have similar ideas of the soul and of life and death and life after death. Those specific things will always kind of recur in human history and in the human psyche because that's just a really integral part of what we truly believe is why we're really here. I think this just stands testament of the importance and the influence that ancient religions like ancient Egyptian religion had. And I think it's like really important that we understand the past because then we're really better able to understand our present. Anyway, let me know what you think. Let me know if you are able to communicate with ancient Egyptian gods. Tell Osiris that I love him. Stop.